Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about culture bias, which is the second part of your issues and debates topic. So remember, this one is an issue rather than a debate, so the issue surrounding how culture is portrayed in psychological research. So what we're talking about here is the tendency to judge people in terms of our own cultural assumptions. So we assume that everybody else behaves in a similar way to us, because we consider ourselves to be the norm, and therefore that means we judge people based on this. Now, culture refers to our values, our beliefs, and our patterns, and you must know the definition of a culture as well, because this means that a culture can go beyond just a country. So we're not just saying people in that country hold the values and beliefs and patterns, but that it's shared by a group of people, and those people could be dispersed throughout several countries. The problem, or the main problem with psychological research for this theme, I guess, is that we mostly use white middle-class American males as participants. And that means that we're not truly representing how all cultures behave. And it might be that some behaviours are very cultural specific, whereas some behaviours can be universal across all cultures. So I want you to think about, how can we categorise cultures in psychology? What is the problem with this categorisation? What impact this might have on research, and how can we overcome this? So we obviously categorise cultures through individualism and collectivism. Individualist societies being ones that focus on independence, whereas collectivist cultures focusing on interdependence. And we normally divide that up in terms of Western cultures are more individualistic, whereas Eastern cultures are more collectivist. However, you can see a clear divide here, and that is one of the problems, that we're assuming that all Eastern cultures are similar and all Western cultures are similar, when that might not be the case. And as we've already said, we also use individualist cultures way more in research than collectivist cultures. And therefore, this is going to have an impact, because we're not going to find out about how collectivist cultures behave, or how there are individual differences within those collectivist cultures as well, or whether the the behaviour is universal. So to overcome this, we obviously need to spend more time researching collectivist cultures and in different subsets of those cultures, recognise that we can't just split it into two distinct groups. So our first term is universality, and this is the idea that we sometimes assume that all behaviour, or a particular behaviour, is the same across cultures. So we assume that this one thing will be the same for everyone, so everyone conforms in the same way, or everyone obeys for the same reasons. Ethnocentrism is kind of the opposite of this, and it basically says that we judge others by our own culture. So we assume that our culture is ultimately better than everybody else's, and it should be used as the gold standard against everything else. So in Mary Ainsworth's study, she assumed that how American babies and parents attach to each other is normal, and therefore everybody else should behave in the same way. This might lead us to judge that culture if they're not the same. So we know, for example, German and Japanese cultures were considered very different and not considered the norm. German parents were meant to be dismissive and more likely to be overly, more likely to leave their children on their own, whereas Japanese cultures are more likely to share and be clingy to their child, which is actually not the case. It's just cultural differences. So our next term is cultural relativism, and this is the idea that our norms and values can only be understood within this culture. So in answer to our last question, how do we overcome this? We need to recognise that some behaviours are culturally specific. You're only going to see those within that particular culture. And in order to understand that culture and that culture's behaviour, we need to understand their social context and their cultural context. We might be able to do this better by integrating ourselves with that culture, or asking researchers from that culture to share their knowledge and experience in order to help us undertake a piece of research. Now, what happens is that some researchers try to take their particular theories or research tools to other cultures, and this is an imposed ethic. Note there's a slight difference between imposed ethic and kind of ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism is that we're judging other people, but this is we use the tools in order to impose a particular behaviour, to say this behaviour is the gold standard. So Mary Ainsworth used her secure, insecure, resistant, insecure, avoidant tool, her way of measuring attachment, and assumed that everybody, whatever culture they're in, would apply to this. So to avoid this, we can take an emic approach. And this means that we study those behaviours that are specific to those cultures. And we say that this is culturally specific. Like in America, we will find these 3 behaviours. And in this culture, most people are going to be secure, and secure is seen by those people as a positive behavioural a positive attachment. So if we look at an example for us, so if we have to give like 2 topics, our first topic might be the social influence topic in an exam, where we have to give like 2 topics that we've studied and apply it to the theory. So one that we can do is Milgram's research in social influence. And his research is ethnocentric because it suggests that people will obey due to specific situational factors. For example, they will obey if an authority figure is wearing a uniform, or the proximity of the authority figure is close, for example. But this is a problem because that might not take into account the fact that there are other cultural influences that might have an impact, maybe in collectivist cultures or in a particular culture, that are more likely to conform or obey. Culture-bound syndrome then is the idea that there are a set of symptoms classified as treatable illnesses in certain cultures, but we don't recognise that in the West, or it's seen as like the norm. For example, in other cultures, it is acceptable to talk to their dead. For example, in Mexico, they have a Day of the Dead where they bring up all the dead bodies of their ancestors, they dig them up again, and they parade them around, they sit them down, and all the children of the ancestors talk to them and tell them about what's been going on this year. Now that seems really odd to someone from the UK, but actually for them that is totally acceptable, that everybody is discussing things with their ancestors. They believe that they are genuinely sharing knowledge with them. Another example of this is the Jumping Frenchmen of Maine, and it's well worth watching this video. And basically talks about people who are in a very tiny community, where some of them got this syndrome where if they were scared, they did exactly what you were told them to do. So if you shouted something and they weren't expecting it, so if you shouted, jump over there, they would do it without question, without thought. They'd just do whatever you said, to the point at which it was dangerous, because if you said to do something horrific, they would do it. And this is showing culture-bound syndrome because it suggests that in that culture, it was acceptable, and in that sub-community, it's acceptable that people had this well-known illness, and that was accepted within that society. Also, we need to consider research traditions of the individuals involved in the research. So this means how exposed to psychological research are the participants in the studies. We can't go into a culture and assume that they have a solid understanding of what it means to take part in psychologiable research, because that culture might not have, for example, GCSE and A levels or equivalents in their, or be able to go to university and study psychology. And therefore, very few people might have a good understanding of what we mean by psychological research, what we're allowed to do in psychological research and what we're not allowed to do in psychological research, and how the data will be used. So what impact will a lack of knowledge have on these people? Well, that means that they are more likely to be fearful of the research, they're more likely to show demand characteristics, and therefore that means you're less likely to get accurate data. So the researchers need to consider this. They need to consider, therefore, how they share the information about psychological research with the participants in their study. And they might need to ask someone from the culture to better explain the cultural limitations of research. So therefore, this might be unethical to study these people because we're not protecting them from harm because they don't understand how their data can be used, what we can or cannot do, and what they're allowed to do and not do, even if we explain that clearly to them. So another situation that you might want to apply this to, as we've already talked about, is the strange situation. So the strange situation here is showing an imposed ethic because it suggests that all cultures have the same perception of what attachment looks like. However, we know that there are differences between collectivist and individualist cultures in terms of what is perceived as a good parenting style. For example, we know that in Japan, parents carry their children around with them for over a year, like physically carrying them everywhere. They need to be close to them. And this is considered good parenting in Japan. So we shouldn't judge that culture and say that they are insecure or have an insecure attachment because of this. We need to understand different cultures' behaviour and what is acceptable and what might be different in another. There's a third example here about the US Army test, about how they gave an IQ test to African Americans, European immigrants, and white Americans, and they found that white Americans performed best on this test. But actually the wording of the questions were arranged so that white Americans would do best on this test because they would know this information, whereas the other two cultures are less likely to. So you might want to have a look at this slide here, which tells you a bit more about that and the negatives and the consequences of the cultural bias on this. Again, this is another section of the PowerPoint which discusses a professor who wants to conduct research on a tribe in Peru and what they need to consider beforehand and when he's replicating Asher's line study. So you might want to think about how language might be an issue, how could research traditions be an issue, and how could the operationalization of the variables be inappropriate. So there's some things to think about there.